From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to them, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Merciful Redeemer, friend, and brother, grant that we may know you more clearly, love you more dearly, and follow you more nearly day by day. Amen. Please be seated. What a story. How can you get past that story of Jesus and the Syro-Phoenician woman? She comes to him desperate for her daughter, and Jesus calls her a dog, and that's hard to get past. When I was a boy, I remember sermons where the rector would try to explain this way. He would say, basically, that everybody knew in those days that a rabbi, the way a rabbi teaches, is by pretending to believe something he doesn't believe and provoking an objection from his followers, which he can then use as a teaching point to bring them out. He said, the rector would say that Mark assumed that everyone would know this. I have a problem with that, though. If you look at last week's story about the washing of the pots and the pans, remember? Mark has to explain to his readers that Jews have special ceremonies for washing their pots. Are we really going to assume that Mark assumes that his readers his listeners will all know how a rabbi preaches? I think that's going a long way. So let's come back to this. I want to start back at the beginning of the story, but I promise I'll get back to the question of how we hear what Jesus says this morning. But one thing to emphasize is that, but one thing to hold in mind, actually, before we go back to the context, is that if you read the book of Acts, the biggest, most important, most divisive, existential question in the early church was the question of what to do with Gentiles who wanted to be Christians or who believed they were Christians. You know, if Christianity grew out of the synagogue, if it was all Jews to begin with, to whom Jesus preached and raised up followers, what do we do with people who come from outside Judaism? Do we require that they actually convert and become Jews and be circumcised and follow all the dietary rules and the washing rules and all those sorts of things, and then they can start following Jesus? Or do we find some subset of the story that we proclaim and say, this is the important stuff in the Christian faith. This is what you need to pay attention to. And of course, Paul went off and became the apostle to the Gentiles. He took that point of view. But there was another group, especially in the church in Jerusalem, which was led by James, Jesus' brother, who took the opposite tack, that the Christian church was inherently Jewish, and that was important and you couldn't give that up. And so the debate about that is what the book of Acts is about, in large measure. And it actually provokes fights between, physical fights in one case, between Paul and James, and then between Paul and Peter, who is with James at the beginning, and whose conversion to this new way of thinking, that God shows no partiality among the nations, he says. That is the key turning point in the book of Acts. So hold on to that. That would have been very much in the air in the church that Jesus, that the book of Mark was written to. It's not, it wouldn't have been ancient history. It would have been decided, but it wouldn't have been ancient history. So one of the things I love about Mark is how chaotic it is, how much is happening all at once. We've heard over and over again that Jesus has this wildly successful ministry. He's followed by thousands of people. He has crowds coming up to him all the time, bringing their poor, their lame, their all the people with various demon possession and all those sorts of things. And it's so crowded and so crazy that all they have to do is get close to Jesus and touch the hem of his garment, and they're healed, and people do that. And Mark tells us about that in detail. And then Jesus, it says he doesn't even have time to eat, so he and his disciples gather together, just themselves, head off in a boat to a private place where they can get some peace, and when they get there, they discover that the crowd is already there, begging for Jesus, that there are 5,000 people, and nobody has brought food. So Jesus performs the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Not because he planned to do it when he woke up that morning, but because he sees those people, he looks at them and he says, they are like sheep without a shepherd, and he has compassion on them. I love that. It's a theme throughout the Gospel of Mark, that compassion is the motivation, above all, that Jesus recognizes in God and that Jesus practices himself. And it's important to say that this is different from the Gospel of John, which we've just spent some time in. You know, the Gospel of John contains 7 miracles. That's it. I'm not saying that John believed that Jesus had only worked 7 miracles, but there are only 7 actual miracles called signs in the book of John. Each one is set up in a very careful way, and each one, bless you, is discussed afterwards at some length. The reason we could just spend 5 weeks in the book of John's account of the feeding of the 5,000 is that Jesus talks for a full chapter after that miracle about what it means. I am living bread that has come down from heaven. All that stuff, really important stuff. I'm not saying it's not, but you don't find that in Mark. Mark is go, go, go. He's constantly responding to people. So now Jesus is still trying to get some peace. He goes to the Gentile territory because he thinks that's where I'm going to get peace. You know, all those people in Israel, they are looking for a Messiah. They think I'm the Messiah. But he is the Messiah. They come to him because he is this special person. Maybe if I go to Gentile territory where I don't have a ministry, they'll leave me alone. So he goes He checks himself into an Airbnb in Tyre on the coast. He thinks he's going to be at peace, and suddenly he's confronted by this woman, this desperate woman whose daughter is demon-possessed, who will break any rule, who will look like whatever in order to get help for her daughter. It's important. This is a big, this is a woman, and Jesus is a man. She's a Gentile. Jesus is a Jew. She is, again, a woman, and Jesus is a teacher, and women were not in a position to be followers of a teacher in that culture. And Jesus was in the house. It doesn't say she knocked at the door or he was out getting breakfast across the street. He was at the house, and suddenly she appears at his feet, a woman alone, and begs him to do this. This is breaking every rule in the book. And Jesus says to her, essentially he says, my ministry is not to the Gentiles, it's to the Jews. It's not right to take the food that is intended for the children and give it to the dogs. And that sounds, we all flinch when we hear that. And again, we'll come back in a minute to why Mark may have told the story this way. But then she says, she doesn't deny what he's saying. She doesn't say, what a jerk you are. She doesn't say, okay, and walk away. She takes him at his word and she says, I know this God that you follow, and you know I know him. My daughter is in need. This God cares about my daughter. And you, as the teacher and embodiment of this God, are going to help my daughter. And that's what she says when she tells that clever little thing about even the children of the master get to clean up the scraps under the table. And Jesus does it. And what I love about the way Jesus does it is, he said he wouldn't do it, and then he did it, and he doesn't waste any time doubling down on his previous thing. He doesn't waste any time justifying what he just said before and say, well, I wanted to explain why I said that. This is what I would do. I want to explain why I said that. It's not that I'm a bad guy. I just had this other thoughts on my mind. But he doesn't. He just does it. And he realizes that this is part of his ministry, that the lady is right, and that this is part of his ministry. And we know that because he then goes along and performs all these miracles in Gentile territory. He heals this guy we heard right afterwards. He goes and feeds 4,000 people in the Decapolis, which is the Gentile territory. He is clearly changing his policy. Now, there are a couple of things about this. First of all, let's be clear. It is not unusual in the gospel, certainly not unique in the Gospel of Mark, that Jesus changes his course based on things that happen. Right at the beginning of the gospel, it says that Jesus, after he's out with Satan in the wilderness being tested, he comes back, and he doesn't start his ministry until John the Baptist is put in prison, is arrested. Then he says, okay, that's my sign, I'm going to go do it now. So it is possible that Jesus simply recognized this moment. It's not that he was wrong before or that he was right before. It doesn't matter what about before, because before is before. What matters is that right now he recognizes that God has called him to something new because of this woman coming and meeting with him. Now, why do you suppose Mark told the story this way? I mean, he didn't have to. I mean, even, let's assume that the story actually happened in some fashion, but Mark could have just said he hesitated, or he decided he refused to help her, or whatever. He didn't have to go through this whole story of calling her a dog and all that kind of stuff. He clearly wants us to internalize this and to think, this is not the gentle and mild lovable Jesus that we tell our friends about if we're telling our friends about Jesus. And I have a theory about that. My theory is this. Jesus, throughout this gospel, loves the person in front of him. He didn't go out wanting to feed the 5,000, but then there are 5,000 hungry people in front of him. He feeds the 5,000. He doesn't go looking for people to heal. People come to him in these great throngs and present themselves to him for healing. And he looks at them and he loves them and he has compassion on them and he heals them. This is not a theoretical thing. He's not setting policy. He is healing on behalf of the God who wants healing for people, and he is going to do that no matter what. And he doesn't heal this woman. He doesn't start healing Gentiles. He starts healing these people in front of his nose, and now he's in Gentile territory, and so he is going to heal them. Think about the story of how Gentiles are going to be welcomed into the church that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Think about how divisive that would have been. Think about the controversies we've gone through in the modern Episcopal Church about the ordination of women, about the inclusion of gay people. Think about those things and how they divided people and divided the church, and the church set policy, and congregations left the church because they didn't agree with the church's policy, and just so much pain and strife. That's what the church in the first century has just been through and is still to some extent going through. I assume that there were congregations of Christians still who didn't want to accept Gentiles, who were all maybe, for example, the church in Jerusalem probably didn't have many Gentiles in it. I mean, it was Jerusalem. There weren't a lot of Gentiles in Jerusalem. So they may never have really had to confront the question of what they would do with Gentiles. Well, I think the way Mark tells the story is a gift, a very gracious and generous gift that Mark, who believes in the inclusion of Gentiles, gives to the people who disagree with him, the people who are still not comfortable with the decision, people who may or maybe feel guilty about the fact that they held the line for a long time, refusing to accept Gentiles in the church because it says this in the Bible or it says that in the Bible. And what he's saying is, look, you don't have to feel bad about this. Jesus had felt this way too. Jesus misunderstood at the beginning of this story what his total ministry was. It wasn't until God opened his mind through this woman that it became true. It became an issue. It became policy. I wish, in a way, and maybe it's impossible, but I wish in a way that the church, our church, had found a way to take this message on board back during the culture wars 20 years ago. You know, my dad, who I think he was a previous generation. I think you would have called him a progressive, but a very moderate progressive. Anyway, when I was in seminary, I remember having long arguments with him about the ordination of women. And he quoted some stuff from the Bible and said it says that, but he wasn't a real Bible thumper. He said, you know, maybe it's just the generation I'm from, but I don't think I could ever accept a woman with that kind of authority. It's just not something I've ever been trained to do. I don't think I could do it. He also said, we had part of the argument I remember, he also said he didn't think he would ever see a woman anchor person on a national news program because he didn't think that he or the nation could accept that. And remember, we were back in the days of Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley. And then, a couple of years later, after I graduated from seminary and moved away for a while, my dad's church, Grace Church in Amherst, just an hour or so down Route 91, hired an assistant priest who was a recently graduated and ordained woman from, I think, General Seminary down in New York. And unfortunately, wasn't involved in the story at that point, so I don't know how my dad anticipated this or what it was like when she arrived or anything like that. All I know is that 3 years later, when this woman finished her assistant role and was called to be rector of a church an hour and a half away, I had to talk my parents out of transferring their membership to the church that she was the rector of because they loved her so much. And I just think that is so illustrative of the truth that we don't love in general, we love in specific. We love people that we love, and so much pain and strife came into the church because parishes that didn't think they'd ever met a gay person, didn't think they'd ever, they're small towns, that kind of stuff. Maybe they'd never met someone who claimed to be gay or anything like that. Suddenly they were asked to sign covenants that said they would be happy to have a gay priest lead them. And in retrospect, now that we all have met lots of gay priests, most of us would say, yeah, of course. But to ask them to do that in the abstract is such a difficult thing and caused so much pain and division. I'm glad that I came to my position on gay priests because when my best friend in seminary came out and I got to know his life and ultimately his partner, and I just saw that they embodied grace in the same way that the heterosexual couples I knew embodied grace. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on for a long time. What I want to say is Verna Dozier, an Episcopal educator, used to say, don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what difference what you believe makes to you and to the world. And I think that's really important. It's not what I believe. It's not what I think in theory. It's I think that the Epistle of James this morning is very, very instructive on this. He doesn't say, well, he does, but he doesn't just say, look, we should practice charity. Look, we should believe in charity. He says, if you were facing this guy from your parish, standing in front of you now, in need, and what would you do? Would you say, go in peace, feel warm, feel fed? That's not going to do any good. He says, think about that. Think about the person in front of your nose. Would you have compassion on that person? That is faith. Amen.